I suspect that they will be thinking, look, the US has described the IRGC as terrorists. The EU, under their law, have now described them as terrorists. So there'll be a sense of wanting to align.
And let's start this hour with a story on the front page of the Times that ministers will introduce a law to enable them to ban Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Jonathan Hall-Casey is the independent reviewer of terror legislation. He's actually been advising the government and calling for action along these lines, but not quite. And he joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Hi.
Just guide us through this, because I know this is complicated. And if people aren't sort of fully across everything, it can be really, really confusing. And I include myself in that. What are the options open to the government right now in how to deal with the IRGC?
So the government could sanction them even more. They're already sanctioned a lot by the British government for breaching human rights. Or they could pass a new law that would allow that to ban every single member of the IRGC and make it an offence to support them. What they can't do, that's the government's view, and it's also my view as well, is to use terrorism legislation, which doesn't apply to state bodies. And the key thing to note about the EU's decision, so the EU have just declared that the IRGC is a terrorist organisation, is that the EU takes the walk like a duck argument. So they say, if someone carries out severe repression, kills, assassinates people abroad, sponsors groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it is a terrorist organisation. So that's the approach that the EU takes. The UK's approach is a bit different. The UK looks more at the identity of who is doing it, and it's much more concerned. If it's a state, it takes a very rigid view. It's a state doing this, therefore we can't call a state terrorist, however bad it acts. And I mean, there are arguments on both sides.
I mean, critics are saying that actually this is going to take too long to bring in a new law. The sources from the government telling the Times today that they hope it would happen this year. But for the people of Iran, this is happening right now. And not everybody in Iran agrees that something like this would make a difference. But some people certainly think they do. And others are really saying, well, actually, proscription is the way forward.
Yeah, it's always quite difficult to know what difference it will make to the behaviour of the Ayatollahs in Iran. As I say, they are already really heavily sanctioned. And if you say, I'm a member of the IRGC, I've got some money in the bank, well, it's going to be shut down immediately. And if someone deals with the assets, they'll be convicted of an offence. So it's not as if there aren't any measures against them. I think probably what we're really talking about is the desire of countries, and this is completely understandable, to say what's going on in Iran at the moment is so wrong that we want to go even further. And what the EU have done, it's quite sort of tough, is to say we are putting you in the same brackets as Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. That's the sort of message that they are sending under the way in which they approach the law. I think what's frustrating here is that the government hasn't got the option of doing that unless it brings forward new laws. It did accept my recommendation way back last year that it would bring forward new legislation, but it hasn't yet found the time to do that. It wants to pass other laws in priority. That's its decision. But the frustration is that unless they do pass new laws, the Home Secretary hasn't even got the choice.
So how quickly, if the government decided that it was a priority, could these new laws go through?
They could go through very quickly indeed. When governments want to act, they can very quickly formulate the policy, instruct people called Parliamentary Council who write down the words that are going to go into the statute, and it could bring forward as emergency legislation, and it would be debated in both houses of Parliament and could go through. And there are examples. For example, after some terrorist attacks, the government has brought in emergency legislation very quickly. I mean, I suppose we're talking sort of, a couple of months. Rather than the suggestion which I'm reading in the press like you, which is that it's going to be later this year, which suggests to me many, many months. So how much parliamentary time would it take if it was rushed through? Because the government's saying that other things are a priority. But realistically, how much time would it take? Well, I would probably say it could be done in a month to 6 weeks. It just depends on how much effort they want to put into it. But in actual time, debating, how much time would it take up politicians and be a distraction from other government business? I'm just trying to work out why they're effectively kicking the can down the road a bit. I mean, the honest answer is I don't really know. I mean, the government has a whole load of legislation that it wants to pass. I guess if it puts things through right now, it would have to bump out time for considering laws about immigration or reform to prisons or reform to justice. It would have to call in quite a lot of favours, because it would be saying to its backbenchers, look, we want to make this very quick. This really means a lot to us. So, I mean, I think you'd have to ask government ministers about that. But it is pretty clear this is not a major priority.
The Times is reporting this morning that MI6 and the Foreign Office are understood to be more resistant to designating the IRGC as terrorists over concerns it will sever diplomatic channels which are relied upon by Britain and its allies. Do you think that is a fair concern?
I think that it is a fair concern. I mean, I think you often get different perspectives. If you are the Foreign Office and you have got an embassy in a location, and there is a British embassy in Tehran. Remember, the Americans haven't got an embassy in Tehran, but the UK do. Then you are obviously going to be worried about any reciprocal impact upon your diplomats. What effect might it have? Might it put them at risk? So it's sort of understandable, and it's part of the perspective. But there'll be other voices, for example, in the Home Office, other voices probably within the Foreign Office, other parts of the intelligence system, perhaps even politicians, will say, well, it's a risk that's worth taking. I mean, after all, they have been sanctioned very heavily already. This wouldn't change things massively. I think that perhaps the difference that I talked about to begin with between the UK and the EU, it's quite a big move to say that another state is a terrorist organisation. And just to sort of illustrate why that's quite difficult, of course, it's right that what the IRGC do is particularly bad, if you like, irregular. Their use of assassination as a tactic, their sponsoring of terrorist organisations, their repression of people. But every state ultimately is able, isn't it, to use force either in policing or in military activity. And often it's quite difficult to determine at what point you say a state that's using force is acting in a sort of terrorist way as opposed to acting in a regular way. So, I mean, I understand why the UK takes this point that if it's a state body, it doesn't commit terrorism, but it does then require them to bring in new legislation.
Is there a danger that the British government looks weak by doing this and by not prescribing or banning or whatever it is under the current legislation? I know you've outlined why that is, but is there a concern about perception here?
Yes, I suspect that there will be thinking, look, the US has described the IRGC as terrorists. The EU, under their law, have now described them as terrorists. So there'll be a sense of wanting to align, and if there was military action or something like that, part of using sanctions, or we're talking about proscription, is to sort of send a signal and to say that we are allied with our allies against an entity or a state which we think is particularly bad at the moment. So I suppose there will be a sense of missing out. I think it's also just worth adding that we are talking about prescriptions. That doesn't exist either for the EU or for the US. And just to illustrate that, there are anywhere between 200,000 and 600,000 members of the IRGC, if you include the reserves. If you were to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, every single one of those people, some of whom will be conscripts, would be treated as committing a terrorist offence. I mean, that's quite a big deal to say that part of what is actually part of Iran's regular military would be committing a terrorist offence simply by being members of the IRGC. That's not how the law works in the EU. It's not how the law works in the US. So there are differences, but you're right. I think the UK will be feeling a bit lonely if it can't go further. But in order to have that choice, the government has to bring forward legislation.
Thank you so much for coming on and explaining that to us. I'm really grateful to you.
Thank you.
That is Jonathan Hall, KC, the independent reviewer of terror legislation.